Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Corte Madera Town Council meeting of January 16th. Would you kindly call the roll, Rebecca?
Councilmember Andrews.
Present.
Councilmember Bailey. Councilmember Ravazio.
Yes.
Vice Mayor First.
Here.
Mayor Condon.
Here. Thank you. Everyone is here for the exception of Sloan Bailey. And now, if you'll please stand and join us in the salute to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, right now it is time for open time for public comment. Please confine your comments to anything that is not on this evening's agenda. But you are invited to speak, and you have 3 minutes. Good evening, Dr. Bundy.
Bob Bundy, 89 Golden Hind Passage. I wanted to speak here to congratulate Marin Audubon Society for completing the restoration of the site at the end of Industrial Way. They've recreated wetlands. They've also created some upland refugia. It's a very nice project. I've been out there a number of times with people to look at it and also talk to others who have been out there and like the project, but are very concerned about the chain link fence that was installed. And I'm thinking back to the conversation that the council had in regard to possibility of a chain link fence around the Mace Rich Town parking lot adjacent to Nordstrom, where there was a great deal of concern about why we would have a chain link fence out there. And I was involved with Marin Audubon and Barbara Salzman in supporting, as did the council and many people in town, donating to this restoration. I did not recall a chain link fence being discussed at that time. And as I look at it, I don't see the value that it's providing. It is off the levee trail that most people use when walking dogs or hiking or just going from Corte Madera to San Rafael. And it's sort of separated from this upland refugia by a small wetland area that would discourage people from going across and some dogs from going across. And I would like to sort of bring this to your attention and see if we can't ask what the purpose of this is. Is this really necessary? It really creates somewhat of a blight on that area, especially when we're trying to get all of the other chain link fences removed that were there for the subleases on the Smart property. Those are gone. So now we have this really not pristine, but nice wetland, upland marsh area that we can really be proud of and that we'd like people to see, and has this one blight on it with this chain link fence. So I would encourage you to go out and look at that and see if we can't work with Marin Audubon in maybe seeing what's the real necessity of having that out there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bob. We'll look into that. Thank you. Anybody else for public comment? Okay, seeing none, I will close it to public comment. This evening, we don't have any presentations, so we'll move on to the consent calendar. The purpose of the consent calendar is to group items together which are routine or have been discussed previously and do not require further discussion. They'll be approved by a single motion, and any member of the town council, staff, or the public may request removal of an item for discussion. And if anything is removed, then we will reschedule it. One thing that I want to pull is the minutes. And let's see, that is 417. And so does anybody have anything else that they would like to pull?
I will move 4.1.1 through 4.1.6.
I'll second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded.
Councilmember Andrews.
Yes.
Councilmember Bailey. Councilmember Ravazio.
Yes.
Vice Mayor First.
Yes.
Mayor Condon.
Yes. The reason I pulled it is because we got a communication from Jonna Hale, and there was a point that she wanted to point out that the minutes should reflect the actual status of Altaway, which is a public right-of-way, not a private road. And this is on page 22 of the minutes of December 19th. Councilmember Bailey referred to Altaway as a private road, and it is, in fact, a public right-of-way. And she also attached a Chapman Park subdivision map, and it shows that name. And she added, for more than 100 years, Altaway has functioned as a public right-of-way that is not town-maintained. So at any rate, I am going to give these corrections to our clerk, to Rebecca. And if we can have a motion to approve the minutes as amended.
So moved. And what is the amendment? Is it that it's privately maintained public right-of-way?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, and we had,
I'll second.
okay.
I was through the mayor, if I may, Madam Mayor. I think the question that I have is whether the correspondence we received is suggesting that the draft of the minutes inaccurately recorded what was said, or whether the member of the public was suggesting that what was said was incorrect in her view. And if it was the latter, then the minutes should not be changed. The minutes are a record of what was actually said at the meeting, even if it is true that something that was said was incorrect at the time. And so I would ask the clerk that perhaps the clerk can take a look to see whether what was actually said at the meeting, but the minutes should reflect what was said, again, even if that statement was not factually correct, or perhaps it was factually correct.
Would we be able to maybe footnote that statement and
Yeah.
put
Can
the
you put it-
correction below? Because I could see where somebody'd come along in 10 years, read that and say, oh, it's a private road.
Yeah.
Next question.
Can we put like an SIC and fill it
Or, you know,
in?
an asterisk with a footnote at the
Yeah.
bottom.
We could do something to make clear that, to the extent that statement is inaccurate, we could make clear that at the time. But the minutes should reflect what was said at the time. So I think we can achieve both of those goals if that is the council's desire.
Okay,
Good.
good, thank you. Okay,
So do you want to amend your,
So the
Yeah.
motion would be to approve the minutes as recorded, but amend them with a footnote stating that Altaway is public right-of-way that is privately maintained.
and I will second that.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Andrews.
Yes.
Councilmember Bailey. Councilmember Ravazio.
Yes.
Vice Mayor First.
Yes.
Mayor Condon.
Yes. Okay, so we've got that, and thank you, Teresa, for that. And we'll move on. This evening, we don't have any sanitary district items, so we'll go on to public hearings. And the first one on our agenda is the consideration and possible action to adopt Resolution 02/18, amending fees and rates for advanced life support and basic life support services and supplies. And we have a report from our fire chief, Scott Schertz.
Thank you. Good evening, Madam Mayor and council members. The item in front of you tonight is a recommendation to adjust the ambulance service fee schedule. As noted in the staff report, fees can be adjusted annually, but have not been adjusted since 2012. Corte Madera currently has the lowest transport fees in the county. The proposed fee schedule will put the town in line with the majority of other public service providers in the area, while still remaining well below the higher rates, both within the county and around the state. As you're well aware, the cost of providing medical care has increased significantly since the last service fee increase in 2012. This is due to various factors, including the price of the drugs we administer and the life-saving equipment that we use, such as advanced cardiac monitors, video laryngoscopes, intraosseous IV kits, etc. General operating expenses have also increased, as they have in almost all sectors of the economy, including employment costs due to the maintenance of extensive training requirements and other routine operating expenses such as fuel and vehicle maintenance. Staff believes that the adjustment to the fee schedule is reasonable and will lead to improved revenue to help offset the expenses of operating the high-quality service currently provided. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
I have a question, and then I'll ask my fellow council members for questions. Will this have any impact on Medicare residents who might call for a 911?
No, the Medicare coverage basically limits the amount that any service provider can charge, and then balance billing is also not allowed by the statute. So patients do not receive the typical balance bill that other covered patients might receive. There are some exceptions to that for certain items that Medicare has allowed some billing of Medicare-covered patients, but nothing in this, what we're doing tonight, would change that.
Will have any impact? Thank
Right.
you. Any questions?
Just a quick one.
Oh,
This is basically just putting us in line with Ross Valley Paramedic, right? I mean, 'cause this is awful close, I think, to what we just approved on that board.
It's very close,
Yeah.
yes. And it does put us exactly in line with a number of other providers, but we will not, there are others that are charging more and some
Right.
charging less.
Jim?
Are these the same charges that are going to Larkspur, or?
Well, Larkspur currently is doing their billing through RVPA, so
Okay.
there's a slight difference, but it's very, very close, as
Okay.
is the tax.
All right.
Okay, Diane?
Thank you. I'd like to piggyback on Carla's question and ask if the policies regarding Medicare are the same for Medi-Cal.
I believe they are. I'm not an expert with that, but the billing agency that we use through Novato Fire District has it all squared away, and I believe that it's the same.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Are there any questions from the public? Yes. Bob, please.
Bob Bundy, 89 Golden Hind Passage. I think the consolidation or working arrangement between Corte Madera and Larkspur is a great step forward and is possibly helping to, cut down some of the expenses that we have with fire safety and paramedic response. In general, the way to further reduce some of these is after we've made this, as Michael Labbert said, baby step of working with Larkspur, is to move forward to a consolidation with the Ross Valley and have the geographic area of Corte Madera to San Anselmo incorporated into a single paramedic service. Currently, we have a significant expense because we have a great service, but it's for Corte Madera and Larkspur. If the consolidation included the entire Ross Valley and brought the same paramedic service that Corte Madera Larkspur enjoys to the rest of the Ross Valley without having to have a separate contract with County of Marin for paramedic services in the rest of the Ross Valley, I think we would see some significant cost savings through that move. So I think that's the future. The current question I would have, and I get questions in the past, maybe not recently, is that Corte Madera residents who have private insurance are ask me about billing in relationship to sort of balanced billing. And is that, I would ask Chief Schertz, is that still in effect? Do we balance bill Corte Madera residents that pay the paramedic tax but are transported and the private insurance doesn't cover the full cost?
Okay, thank you.
The short answer is yes, and it is the policy that has been in place since the council adopted the program, and that policy has not changed.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the public? Okay, in that case, we will close it to public, bring it back to council. Any comments? And if not, then I'll entertain a motion to adopt the resolution amending the fees and rates for advanced life support and basic life support services and supplies.
So moved.
Second?
Councilmember Andrews?
Yes.
Councilmember Bailey? Councilmember Ravazio?
Yes.
Vice Mayor First?
Yes.
Mayor Condon?
Yes. Okay, that carries. Thank you, Chief Charles. And then we'll go on. This topic is to discuss impacts of the pending expiration of Corte Madera's sales tax Measure B in 2020. This is the tax override, and provide information to Town Council for consideration and seek council direction to renew the measure. And this will be presented by our Town Manager, Todd Cusimano.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, members of the council. I would like to introduce our staff that'll be giving this presentation to you tonight, along with myself. To my right is Daria Carrillo, our Finance Director, and to her right is Peter Brown, our new Public Works Director. And what we'd like to do is, instead of reciting the staff report, we have a brief presentation that we would like to provide you, and then after that, answer any questions you may have.
Thank you.
So really, as a follow-up to this conversation and this discussion, we wanted to provide some background with the sales tax measure. In 2013, the council had a number of meetings and discussion regarding a potential sales tax measure, and ultimately agreed to place a half-cent sales tax measure on the ballot to improve, among other things, the town's lack of reserves and lack of funding for capital improvement projects. At the time when this discussion took place, the council had limited reserves, really no reserves, and we had multiple deficits in a number of funds. On November 5th, 2013, the Corte Madera voters ultimately approved that half-cent measure, known as Measure B, by approximately 68%. And the sales tax measure took effect April 1st of 2014 and expires April 1st of 2020. It's a 6-year half-cent sales tax measure. Those expenditures are reviewed annually by the Sales Tax Citizens Oversight Committee. The committee provides annual reports on expenditures of Measure B funds, and those are also, they're available here on our presentation, which will go on our website. But there's also a specific link to our website regarding what the role of the Oversight Committee is and the annual reports that they provide. Some sales tax measure facts. The annual half-cent revenue is approximately $2.5 million annually. The anticipated revenue for the 6-year term of this measure is approximately $15 million. To date, as of January 1st, 2018, the sales tax measure has generated approximately $8.9 million. Of that $8.9 million, you can see they've been allocated in the following 3 areas. $2.3 million has been spent within the approved priority categories confirmed by the Sales Tax Oversight Committee. Currently, approximately $1.7 million is being set aside, and we'll talk about that in a second. And one of the things that staff would like to recommend for future consideration of the council is to set aside that $1.7 million in a sales tax contingency reserve, and we'll talk about that in a second. The other one is approximately $4.8 million that is currently set aside out of the 8.9. It is available and currently approved to be spent in the current town capital improvements project list in the immediate future in the next 2 fiscal years, and Peter will touch on those. Some sales tax rates in Marin County to give a basic overview. The state sales tax rate is 7.25%. It's the top right column. As you move down, you can see specific sales tax measure rates within the county of Marin. There's the Marin Parks Open Space, that's a quarter-cent sales tax. The Sonoma Marin Area Rail Transit District tax is a quarter-cent. And the Transportation Authority of Marin tax is 50 cents. 50%. And so when you look at those, the total for Marin County is 8.25. If you continue down, any city or town that is not listed below that, where you see Corte Madera and below, their sales tax rates are currently 8.250%, just like Marin County. But it gives you an idea of where Corte Madera is respective to the other jurisdictions. We're at 8.750. Larkspur just approved to renew their sales tax measure. It was, at the time, it was a half-cent sales tax. They agreed to bring it to 0.75, which brings them to 9%. That is also a sales tax that continues until the voters rescind that tax. So this gives you a little bit basic idea where we are compared to everyone else. We also did a little bit of an analysis of other Bay Area sales tax rates within the area. We looked at Albany, Belmont, and Hillsburg, and you can kind of see where they are. They're anywhere from 9.750 to 8.625, and so you can, I would argue that we're right in the middle there, middle of the pack. Some of the town council spending priorities with the monies. Again, this is a general sales tax measure, so the town council can spend the funds however they wish to spend the funds, but the council was very specific to the community when we put this measure on the ballot and has held true to date. And really the town council set the following areas of priorities for the monies to be spent, and that's the left category, 1 through 7. So it's to restore the town's general fund reserves, flood control and storm drainage improvements, maintain and rehabilitate the roads, senior and youth programs, safe routes to schools, disaster preparedness, and fire prevention. One of the things I want to point out in number 1, the sales tax measure allowed us to build our reserves to approximately $1.8 million. Currently, we have a $1.8 million or 10% operating reserve fund. The sales tax measure allowed us to do that because we didn't have to use operating funds on capital improvements projects. But I also want to point out that the sales tax revenues from the measure did not go to that reserve. They stayed specific to capital improvements types of projects. And I wanted to point that out, and Dario will cover in more detail how those revenues were expended. Something in talking to the Oversight Committee, if we continue moving forward, and again, we would recommend that we work through the Oversight Committee with this, but we potentially want to propose the scope of spending and make it more inclusive and better define the areas that we may want to spend those monies. For instance, when you look on the left column and you look at like safe routes to school, but you also have maintain and rehabilitate our local roads. You know, when you look at a roadway, it's really all encompassing. And so what is to the layperson, what does safe routes to school mean? Well, it's pedestrian and bicycle safety improvements. And so we look at roadways, the totality of the roadway. And so, and Peter can give you the definition of a multimodal transportation improvements, but how I look at it in a simplistic mind is that's the road. That's our roads. That's our streets and roads and infrastructure, from sidewalks all the way to the middle of our roadway. Flood control related infrastructure, again, it would continue to cover that. A community program, senior and youth, it continues. It should be available for town reserves in those instances of economic, downturns or major disasters, i.e. Sonoma, Napa County, earthquakes, fires. There's a lot that takes place in those situations that we need to be prepared for. In our emergency 911 police and fire response. In this, I did take out, and it's something that is completely open for discussion, but I did remove the conversation of disaster preparedness. That is something that, again, is important to our community. It was part of the vote, very well supported amongst our community. But what we've done is we've actually built, recognizing and having the ability to maintain our operating budgets. Currently, we have built an approximate $500,000 to $900,000 annual surplus within our operating reserves, our operating budget. And we've we've built a revenue source for disaster preparedness moving forward. And so we took it out of the sales tax revenue, availability for the revenues, and we actually put it into our operating budget. And currently, we have the highest disaster preparedness budget than we've had in this town in the last 60 years. So my recommendation would be it can be available for the sales tax override, but I recommend we focus on using those monies for our current operating budget. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Daria, and Daria is going to start off covering really the historical data of the sales tax measure.
Thank you.
Good evening, Town Council. This sheet is a numerical representation of some of the things that the town manager has reported. It shows the history of the sales tax since its inception in the 2013-2014 fiscal year. And as you can see, in the first year, it was just a partial year where the sales tax was collected. So there's only one quarter there, which is why there's only approximately $534,000 in revenues that first year. And there were, of course, no expenditures, as that was a new tax. The second year, the sales tax brought in approximately $2.5 million. Again, there were no expenditures that year. So at that time, the ending balance at the end of 2014-15 was approximately $3 million, which represents the total of the 2 years' worth of sales tax. So the first year that there were expenditures were in 2015-16. And again, approximately $2.5 million was brought in from the sales tax, and about $1 million was expended. And you can see the various categories there that it was expended on. Fire equipment was a large category there, and also streets. And then in 2016-17, again, about nearly $2.5 million was brought in by the sales tax. And you can see the expenditures there. The largest expenditure, that $773,000 category, Safe Routes to School, the majority of that, about $590,000, had to do with accessibility improvements. It was a barrier removal program, which has to do with accessibility. So that was in that category. There was some fire equipment purchased. There, for flood control, that was mainly gates and equipment. And you can see also there was some parks and landscaping equipment that was purchased. The current year only represents a partial year, of course, because it's not completed. The year's not completed. So this was prepared as of last week, and $800,000 has been brought in as of this fiscal year, and those are the expenditures, or that negative amount in disaster preparedness has to do with a payment from Central Marin Police Authority for disaster preparedness, so that's a credit there. And the architect fees are what is in senior and youth programs there. So right now, or as of last week, the ending balance in that in the sales tax fund was approximately $6.5 million. And of course, the total budget, were the total budget to be spent this year, it would be brought down to $3 million. So that's this sheet here. Okay, and then this sheet that's on the screen shows the budget and the budgeted expenditures for various funding sources for capital projects in the current fiscal year. And you can see the total there of the revenue that's expected to be received by the town for capital projects is nearly $5 million. And you can see about half of that is from the sales tax, Corte Madera sales tax. And the budgeted expenditures are about $5.4 million, which is more than half of the $8.8 million. That's the total budgeted expenditures for all funds paying for capital projects. And so the sales taxes, as you can see, is the one at the bottom there, and just going up from there. You can see there's a storm drainage tax there. That's a special tax that charges per living unit or per 1,000 square foot of non-residential parcels. And that generates about $660,000 a year. And those are for projects directly related to flood control and storm drainage. Above that is the capital improvement fund. That's where restricted grants and other revenues are recorded, and their associated expenditures, as well as any contribution from the general fund that is required as a condition of receiving grants. Things like a PG&E, the LED lighting reimbursement for $275,000 in there, Zero Waste Marin County grant for $30,000, and a Transportation Development Act grant of $97,000 for paving is in there. The recreation, Measure A parks, that's one of the taxes that was on one of the previous slides that the town manager discussed. That's the town's share of the 0.25% sales tax, and that's intended for parks and open space and park improvements. Above that, the Recreation Facilities Fund, that has been where a portion of recreation fees have been deposited for the purpose of capital expenditures. And now, right now, you see it says zero. That's because the recreation fees are currently being assessed, so we didn't budget anything in there for now. There's approximately $1 million in there right now, and $100,000 is being budgeted this year for tennis court resurfacing and green room stairs. Transportation Authority of Marin, that's another one of those sales taxes, 0.5% sales tax, and that's the town's share there. Typically, the town receives about $120,000 to $200,000 from Transportation Authority of Marin, and the reason that it's more this year, there's a $640,000, is that I guess the town is allowed to swap federal funds for state funds, which go through the TAM group. So so that occurred for $526,000 for the Tamil Vista Boulevard Bike and a pedestrian improvement project. The AB 1600 street impact fees, that is for fees related to construction projects, which are intended to defray the impact of the construction on town streets and roads. And this year, the budgeted amount for expenditures is intended for street paving. The gas tax, that is received from the state. And that can be spent on any street-related expenditures, such as capital projects or street personnel salaries. And then the Traffic Improvement Fund is where revenues and expenditures related to traffic projects and studies are recorded. So those are the various pots of money and how they're budgeted this year for capital projects.
Okay. We're now to talk about some of our capital improvements projects and infrastructure.
Thank you, Daria and Todd. Madam Mayor, members of the council, I think the story you've heard maybe for the past 5 or 10 minutes might lead you to believe, wow, we got some funds, we're pretty flush, so what are we going to do with this money, and why would we need to renew our sales tax measure? Well, I have the answers to those questions. So this slide and this is just basically if you read your staff report, I know you guys all do your homework, you've read it, so you know these bullets. These are the 8 bullets that kind of talk about some of the near-term improvements that we're looking at. I know the intergenerational center is a top priority. I'm going to show you some preliminary drawings for what's happening at Sanford and Casa Buena and Meadowsweet. And then some of these are catch-all categories. So if you look at the 3rd and 4th bullet, when we talk about pavement maintenance improvements throughout the town, we could easily spend $1 million just working on pavement. That could go away in a matter of weeks. Same thing with curb gutter sidewalk. I was actually speaking to some residents out on Casa Buena, and they're asking me, when is our sidewalk improvement coming? When is our bike lane improvement coming? That project's in design. I don't have any of the design drawings here, but I know that is a community priority. So I also did a field review recently, last week, at Paradise Drive, and where San Clemente comes into Paradise Drive and heads out. And I'm familiar enough with the complications of that corridor. It's narrow, traffic is increased, the trip generators that are out there in terms of the schools, along with drainage on both sides of Paradise Drive, that makes for a really complex corridor that is in need of circulation improvements. So I just gave a range based on my past experience of how much money I thought we could spend out there, looking at traffic control device improvements, bike lane and sidewalk improvements. There's a class 1 pathway set for portions of that. So this is all projects that we can easily spend money on. So let's look at a few of those. And of course, I just wanted to go over, I just got my Google map out here. So this is that Paradise Drive corridor into San Clemente, what we talked about. We've just completed and received the rare community kudos for the improvements on Tamalpais Drive. Tamil Vista is one that I see as, in the near term, we could do very similar improvements to what Tamalpais Drive received, and that is a slurry seal, pedestrian crossing improvements, very clarification of the lanes, bike lanes added in there where there's gaps. So that's a project that we see moving forward in the near term. Of course, the other corridors, coming here on basically on the west side of town are all heavily traveled. We're also looking at improvements to repaving the bikeway out here. I've put Warnham on the list. We've got a grant to do some design and construction work there. So there's a lot happening in our small town. So I don't have any concerns over being able to spend this money, and the fact that I believe, at least professionally, that we need more money in terms of a sales tax measure. Just preliminary drawing. You saw this at your last meeting. This is one of the projects. This is the intergenerational center remodel. That is a low-cost capital improvement, but definitely something that is on our radar to get moving in the next few months. I wanted to show you a little bit because we have preliminary drawings. We're thinking about intersections. So what we have here, you are all very familiar with this intersection, I'm sure. Tamalpais Drive, Sanford, the mall is just on the other side here. So this is a 4-way traffic intersection that has 3 legs that work. So there is not a lot of confusion if you come east or west, or if you come from the north. But if you're coming from the south, just go out there if you don't believe me at any time of the day, you will see people with this yield and this yield bar and the lights. Maybe it's red and they want to make a right turn, but there's a car here that's not keeping clear, and so this car who's making a left or the delivery truck can't make. So we have some circulation issues here. And we have some ideas for how to fix them. So the cheap and easy fix is simply paint. We can extend the stop bar, make this a stop instead of a yield, create a better turn radius here, add a bike lane pocket. This is kind of one of the low-cost things that we can do, and probably will do something similar to this summer. There are other improvements we could do. This, of course, requires right-of-way. This is a drawing that shows that while this is a nice landscape bulb out here, it doesn't really help in terms of traffic circulation. So by bringing this movement on Sanford to here, having folks queue up, and then having your predominant movement be on Casa Buena, there would be a marked improvement there. Other options we're considering, and personally, I think that when we look at this corridor for Casa Buena and Meadowsweet, we also need to consider the intersections at Connow for both streets, because those intersections are substandard. There's red curb that's needed for sight lines. Squaring those up and really considering how people are moving throughout the whole corridor, in my opinion, is probably the best way to look for a longer-term solution. So there goes, a good chunk of your capital improvement money. This is an aerial of the Tamil Vista project, which we also have. Tamil Vista Boulevard. We have some preliminary drawings that I'll show you here momentarily, but when I looked at it last week, it really did seem to me like a project that was ripe for the improvements that Tamalpais Drive got right here in front of Town Hall. And so that is a project that ultimately, I think when I talked to the consultants and the current engineers on staff, as well as our engineering consultant, there's talk of right-of-way delineation, working with development in the corridor for a long-term solution. But the near-term solution really that I could see was, redo the pavement and repaint the roadway to make it really clear and understandable. I think at our narrowest points, we only have 40 feet of roadway. So much of the corridor has, some people call it the suicide lane. I prefer a two-way left turn lane. It sounds to me so much less deadly. So maintaining that two-way left turn lane for access to all these properties and businesses is really important for much of this corridor, but so would be better delineating the traffic lanes and adding bike lanes for what amounts to be a fairly well-traveled bicycle corridor. So I'm going to turn it back over to Todd, but I did want to just kind of highlight some of the projects that we're looking to do in the near term, just in case anyone's afraid that we have money that we can't spend. You'll see improvements on the ground, and I'm sure you'd rather see that than full fund balances.
Thanks, Peter and Daria. Thank you. Can I ask, up to this point, if there are any questions from the council or from the public right now? Any questions for either Daria or Peter? I have one question, Peter, for you. Back on the Paradise Drive map, you have it marked for the San Clemente area. Mm-hmm. But I know that we've spoken in the past and continued it to where the schools are, that there's going to be pedestrian, safe pedestrian walkways. Now, I don't see it highlighted there, but is that included in your plans?
Definitely. Yeah, there's no doubt that a lot of the issues, especially in the peak hour for school drop-off and pickup, are out on what would be the western edge of Corte Madera. So when I say that corridor, I mean from the town limits where Paradise Drive turns in unincorporated county, all the way through to the intersection of Paradise and San Clemente. And to be honest, I see some improvements that we could do all the way up to here, all the way up to the intersection that leads to access to 101. So I agree, there's different costs for different types of solutions. There's no doubt that these portions of Paradise Drive, where all the schools are, is a primary concern. But from a transportation standpoint, to me, this is a travel corridor that starts at the town limit and basically takes you all the way to 101.
Yeah, okay, good, I'm glad, because even with the little rain that we had, there's all kinds of little flooding areas, and then the backup is just untenable there. So thank you very much. Any questions from the public?
Yes.
Yeah, questions or comments? Yeah.
Hello?
We'll have to see what Todd says, but right now, this will be in regard to what has been presented up to this point.
Patty Stoliar, Casa Buena Drive, and these are two of my babies. One is, what was the $27,000 that was spent on disaster preparedness for? And the other is, what was the note that said $30,000 for seniors? Thank you.
Bob Bundy, Golden Hind Passage. I think the areas that Peter's pointed out are areas that really are in need of some kind of fix and upgrade. I wanted to support the continuation of the sales tax in part because I'm also looking at the expiration of the flood tax in 2023. And because Public Works has done such a good job of preventing flooding in Corte Madera, we haven't seen the problems that have been in Ross Valley and some other communities, that I think it would be unlikely, or maybe unlikely, that we could get the residents to support a continuation of the flood tax, even though I recognize that there are a lot of flood-related projects, levees, drainage issues, a lot of things that need to be taken care of. And it may be that that would not be able to be passed in the future just because Public Works has done such a good job, and that utilizing that sales tax for flood-related projects has been outlined may be the good solution to that. Thank you.
Thank you. Jane?
Yes, Jean Greenbaum, Casa Buena Drive. I'm also on the Oversight Committee. And I just want to note that if I hadn't read the IJ or gotten an email that went out to everybody, the Oversight Committee, I don't believe got separate notices or highlighted notices, so I didn't even know really what this was about. And it probably would have been a good idea to have the committee here, as many members as possible. We do have two, right? 40% of us did show up, so I don't know what happened there. And I guess I'm confused. So this still is going to have to go to the voters. I guess I'm confused as to what the process in the next 2 years is going to be, or what the timeline is to give us more time to, get feedback and talk to you guys.
Right, and this was sort of the first.
Okay.
The first
Yeah.
time to get this, because we were really trying to be proactive on this particular issue. Carl?
So this is open comment, okay. Hi, Carl Spursum, 73 Lakeside Drive. I appreciate you folks coming, because actually I was really more interested in your presentation as opposed to the town's, because I would have liked to hear their commentary on kind of how this has gone on for the last 4 years. So I hope you do get a chance, and I hope we get notified by that, so I appreciate your hard work. My comments are a little jumbled around, because this is a very interesting reading, by the way, the comments from the last meeting on this, where it was passed. So I'm going to jump around a little bit. I apologize. And I wish Sloan Bailey was here, because he has some of the most critical comments in this. So I'm sorry he's not here. I would have liked to have heard his updates. I guess a few things I would just say, kind of as a humor, take temporary out of any kind of tax, because no tax is temporary. So I guess honesty is a big part of going to the voters with this. And, in reading this, I would remind Councilwoman First, you actually hope this would be canceled prior to the sunset in your comments. So I'd almost like to say all these comments from the prior meeting should be entered in again, because I think there's some fascinating thoughts in here. And I guess I'll just keep going, jumping around. This thing barely passed in 2013 by 68%. And what I saw on the flow chart, the matrix, you had a lot of things going on where it would pass, but the option where it didn't pass was let it expire, and then there was nothing else. So clearly, I think the town needs to be prepared for this thing to not pass. People don't like taxes, and it barely passed. So I think whatever gets written up for this has to be brutally honest. Also, I'm surprised that the actual revenues come in 25% higher than what was estimated each year. So I think it's been very successful. So I would question again why it needs to keep going on that basis. What else can I talk about here, just as taking my notes? Also, the prior presentation had a lot to do with the town's debt problems. A lot of that was focused on the Corte Madera Center. I didn't hear anything in this presentation that reflected on the debt problems that were in place when this first passed. So I would hope in future meetings that might be addressed as well. And whether or not that is a key reason for this to be going. Tax revenues are clearly surging in town here. So I would say that, I think the tax has done its job. And I think it should just be sunsetted out. That being said, town needs money. I really appreciate the hard work Todd has done in getting some funds and accounts and getting some money in there for contingency reasons. So I'll just kind of stop there. There's just a lot of things. I think this was very interesting reading, and I would actually hope that maybe this commentary, these discussion comments, be included in the next meeting's presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Are there any comments or questions that were made that anybody of staff would like to address at this point?
Yes, thank you. I would, Madam Mayor, members of the council. I'll have to go back and the question regarding the disaster preparedness monies spent last fiscal year, I can provide an itemized list, but a majority of that went to our neighborhood response groups. We really focused with the neighborhoods and provided $27,000 worth of support, but again, I can provide that itemized list. The funding for the senior programs and disaster preparedness that are listed that you referenced are in this current fiscal year. They're available to be spent as needed as those programs are identified, and we're looking at those funds now to support some of the senior programs we're looking at with the new intergenerational center, and so we have support there. But again, that's something we would take back to council and give an update on what we're thinking with those. Carl brought up a lot of valid points, and it starts with the minutes from 2013, and I think it is good reading. It was helpful for me as a new manager here. I was the chief when this was discussed, but to actually really go back and read those minutes, and so we provided that for the council and the community. And how I took those, and again, I think that the community will have a chance to come back up and talk about that, but at the time, and it's in the staff report, it's important to point out. So when we look at the last 50 years for the town, the worst fiscal crisis we were in was from 2005 to 2010. And there's a link that you can go to on our website and look at that. And it was a $2.5 million deficit. Councilmember Ravazio talked about it a couple of meetings ago, where our sales tax revenue just dipped, and it dropped on an average over 5 years to about 5.5 million. It depleted all of our reserves. At the time, the timing of it was poor for the town. We had just looked at the shopping center purchase. We had built some debt up, and it caused a lot of problems for us. When I went back to the minutes, some of it was confusing to me of where the town treasurer at the time, George Warman, really listed 4 major critical deficits within the town. And some of it was, I didn't look at it necessarily as a deficit. I looked at it as debt. You own that debt, but I focused today more on the structural deficit, and I focused first on the operating budget. Okay, so our operating budget today is approximately 18 million. Our expenditures annually, because of the work we have done with the finance committee of Vice Mayor First and Councilman Andrews and Daria and myself and the department heads, we've really focused on starting there. So when you talk about taxes and we communicate with our residents, it starts there, the operating budget. We already have a number of taxes, and that's the 18 million, and to work within our means, and then to build a surplus for those good times and those bad times. And so what we've done is we've been able to build from 2010 to date, and really 2013 to date, a $1.8 million 10% reserve. And so that's important. The other part is we had to make our own future. We can't use taxes, and we don't want to use the current or additional general fund monies to handle some of our unfunded liabilities. And so as we've talked about at length, the 2 consolidations of police and fire have freed up hundreds of thousands of dollars. And what we did is we took that monies and we put it towards our trust funds that we've talked about in the last few council meetings. That number is approaching 850,000 annually. One is the 500,000 for the retiree health. The other installment is the 380,000 for our pension liabilities. We have an additional $250,000 coming for the pension liabilities to take us over $500,000 in 2 years. The consolidation of fire also is going to help us save $500,000 annually. And so there's future discussions for the council and the community to decide how we fund our unfunded liabilities and what we do with that monies. My point with that is not to get off track, but these are all major issues in the order of handling our town funds in a way that our community can follow and understand. And really, honestly, that is not going to happen until June of this year, when our technology and our Tyler infrastructure for our financial system can be easily accessed by the community on the websites, and it can be easily understood. And that will not happen until June, but that's a priority for us. My point is, we've handled the operating budget. We've built our reserves. The conversation in 2013 then, if we look back, was, well, we need to improve our reserves, we need to improve our financial position, but we also need funding to do our capital improvements projects. We have a $20 million plus flood control system. As we move forward and we get into 2020 and beyond, the conversation of sea level rise and what the plan is for the big picture solve of that, of our vulnerabilities. What is our answer for that? That's $20 to $50 million, depending on what we talk about. And when you look at our immediate infrastructure needs for, as Peter just went over, those projects, that's $13 million. The council at the time struggled with this. The community struggled with it, but this was a 50% plus one vote. The sales tax measure wasn't a 2/3 vote. It was a 50% plus one. So it didn't barely pass. It passed by 18% of the vote. 68% is a lot. And so it was supported by the community. But something the community and the council struggle with was, okay, we want to improve our finances, but we also want this money to maintain and improve the infrastructure, so we did it for 6 years. And so this is coming back to council now and the community to have this discussion to say, hey, let's look back 5 years now and let's see where we're at. Let's reevaluate this, to Carl's statements, because I think he's right on. And what I would tell you is the council set the priorities exactly as they should. And we followed those priorities exactly as the council directed staff. It's for the capital improvement and infrastructure of our town. And without the sales tax override, when you go to that, when you go to the pots of money and you look at what we have available to us annually, it's right there. So if you take 2.5 million off, you're down to, you're down to $2.5 million available, and if you really take out the grants and some of the things that ebb and flow, you probably have less than 1.9 million available to do the capital infrastructure of our town. And that depends if the state or the federal government, if they decide to take something else away and change the game like they have done historically for the last 40 years. My point is I'm very confident to sit before any forum and tell you that if we do not continue the sales tax override, this measure, we will not be able to meet the needs of our infrastructure for our town moving forward. And so I think the assumptions that the town and the community made back in 2013, 2014 was right. We needed this to improve and maintain our community, our infrastructure. And so I think it's good it was 6 years. We have a chance after 4 to 5 to reevaluate it, to say, okay, I think and that's for this council and the community to decide, but yep, we need it to maintain our capital infrastructure. And knowing that, you shouldn't put an expiration date on it. It should be, you may want to consider a longer term or until the voters take it back, similar to what Larkspur said. Because again, it's for our long-term status of our infrastructure. And the other point that I'll just add, and if Peter wants to say anything, jump in, is that I do think, and it's to, again, Carl's point, let's reevaluate our taxes. So 2 things that I throw out there to the council for consideration. The first one is when you look at the storm drainage tax, that was in the early 80s, Dr. Bundy talked about it. It was for maintenance and capital improvements of that, and we really use it really every other year. We bank approximately $1.2 million to revenue installments of that tax, and we improve, if we have to, our $20 million flood infrastructure. A lot of times it includes pump stations. Pump stations to replace them are anywhere from $500,000 to $750,000 annually. Plus, we'll do other improvements to the storm. We'll do slot drain improvements and other things. And so, it gives you an idea what those costs are. But when you look at the tax, it expires in 2023. When that expires, it's a different conversation that we're going to have as a council and as a community, because it's the bigger picture, and that's Peter and his team are going to work on that. What do we do with the vulnerability analysis that we know that has been made for the town? What are our vulnerabilities, and what is it going to cost to make those improvements? The town council recently made one of the major priorities of our town is that discussion. Flood control, what are we going to do in the future? And so we're going to start to have a number of community meetings to start to talk about what are the vulnerabilities, do we agree on those vulnerabilities, what are the options and the solutions, and what are the costs for those solutions, and then what are the funding sources for those solutions. So when you get to and this is a multi-year conversation, when we get to 2023, it's not going to be to renew the storm drainage tax at that rate. It's a whole different conversation. At that time, hopefully we have, what does the big picture solve? And do we agree on it? And what are the funding mechanisms? Grants, operating budget, our pots of money, a potential tax. So when I tell you that long drawn-out story and background, what I'm trying to say is if there's an opportunity now of, look, that sales tax override, and I go back to the 2013 conversation, it held true. Your expectations and your concerns and your thoughts and what you wanted it for, you were right. It's for capital improvement projects. And so knowing that and knowing how much money we have available to us and how successful it's been, and, you know, staff will probably disagree to a part, and they're available to, you can ask them. But what I throw out there to you is you may want to consider, and we may in our communications communicate that to our community, starting with the oversight committee, is like, look, we need to have this Corte Madera sales tax has to continue. And if it continues, and we know it can continue for a long period of time, let's look at that storm drainage tax and reevaluate it, because we have funds to maintain our infrastructure based on that same philosophy, and start that 2-3 year conversation of what are our vulnerabilities, what are the solutions, what are the costs, and what are the funding mechanisms, and continue that conversation over 3 years into 2020, 2023 with our community, and talk about what that looks like. It's a long drawn-out answer, but I really wanted, in my head, it's been in there, and I want to communicate it publicly, because it's I think what we thought was completely accurate, and now knowing that, I think we need to consider, should this be a 6-year tax, or should we look at a longer-term type of deal? And with that, we have 2 windows. It has to, if it's going to be a 50% plus 1 tax, vote of the voters, sales tax, it has to be on a council election. And so you have June of 2018, and the next one is November of 2019. But as we've talked about, we're going to have to look at that election date. There's a good chance that it could be moved to 2020. So you have these 2 windows. And again, this is up in April of 2020. It's one that we have to have, and I know Peter's dying to say something, so I'm gonna give it to him. Thank you.
Thanks, Todd. Peter?
Thank you for those comments, Todd and Madam Mayor, members of council. The couple things I wanted to add that relate to both what you heard from your town manager and some of the public comments. Todd talked a little bit about pump stations, flood control channels. Right now, we're in good shape with those. Our channels are well maintained. Our pumps are all working, but you know, I'm not sure that 500,000 or 750 are going to go a long way if something goes wrong. If we need to repair a levee, if we need to fully replace a pump station, these are big ticket items, and they can very easily eat through what appears to be a decent amount of funds. So that's something that you all need to be aware of. Another member of the public was talking about process. I think everyone here and on the dais is aware that the council votes to put this to the voters, and then the voters decide what they want to do, right? So that's the step, the very first step of that process. As a new member in Corte Madera, one of the things that strikes me is that Corte Madera residents cannot support Corte Madera businesses. There are so many businesses in this town. You've got 2 major regional malls. You have auto dealerships that are selling huge amounts of value vehicles. So basically what that means, if you're a resident of Corte Madera, you like a sales tax revenue to some degree because other people are paying for it, right? People who come from Santa Rosa and San Francisco and Richmond and Berkeley to shop for whatever it is, cars or Lululemon goods or REI, they're spending their money in your town because it's a nice town to shop in and you have a bunch of amenities. So that is a good thing if you're a Corte Madera resident, and you're basically leveraging regional funds to fund your local improvements. I also think that the member of the public, Carl, who Todd referenced, has a good point. Sales taxes are not that popular. There's all kinds of reasons to not want to have to pay extra taxes, right? That's a very reasonable argument. But one thing that, actually the last thing that I'd like you all to be aware of are some of the macroeconomic trends that we're facing. And you've heard about the struggles with brick and mortar. We know how much sales are going online, and we know about the difficulties of tax mechanisms for where to collect those. That's a real thing. So it could very possibly be that even with sales doing really well in the future, revenue could go down for Corte Madera. The same is true for technological change with autonomous vehicles. We are in the heyday of personal automobile ownership. Many of you probably are aware that in the future, far fewer people are going to own vehicles and they're going to order rides. And the sales tax that comes to this town from that is going to be impacted. So those were a few things that came to mind, and I know the council certainly has their own discussion, but thank you for the opportunity to respond.
Thank you. Just to add to it, too, I remember when we were right in the midst of the economic downturn, and there was no money to spend when we needed to, particularly, I remember the rolling stock for DPW. And the DPW guys were out there literally jerry-rigging up the trucks just to make them go. And I think fire also was doing a lot of very innovative little tasks to try to keep everything operating. And so finally we started getting back in, and I've always prided our town in having probably the best infrastructure of any of the other cities in Marin. But just because we're going at maybe the best level today, it doesn't mean that in 6 months from now there's going to be a problem. We can't stay that way just indefinitely. So I think that rather than wait until we're really in dire straits, where the cost to do repairs becomes so prohibitive, that best to just keep at a maintenance level. And that doesn't come cheap either with the intricate flood system and the flood control systems that we do have. Now, this is just basically a discussion. Does anyone have anything to add? Yes, Diane.
Thank you. I remember when we embarked on this effort back in 2013, we had been dealing for several years from the economic downturn, and it was really, really difficult for the town. We had furloughed employees, we had reduced staff, we had given up, a lot of purchasing. Carla described some of it regarding some of our big capital items that we put off, and it was not always easy for staff to keep the old stuff running. We're finally out of that hole, and we're able to spend a little money. And what we get out of it is really valuable for this town. We get things like safety improvements on Tamalpais Drive. We got new equipment for the firefighters and for DPW. We are investing in the community center to improve some underutilized space so that we can expand our program offerings for seniors and youth. These are investments in the community that we weren't able to make for many years. So I am thankful to the voters who voted to approve this sales tax measure back in, I think it was 2013, or maybe it was 2014, I guess. Back at the time, one of the speakers mentioned that I had said quite a number of statements that are reflected in the minutes of August 6th, 2013, about my concern that this kind of become a permanent thing. I will admit that that was very much at the forefront of my mind at the time, and I was basing that a lot on an experience that another town in Marin had. They passed a similar measure. All the funds went to the general fund, and then they just kind of became part of the regular budget. And in fact, when the sales tax was about to expire, they were trying to figure out how they were going to make their budget balance at that point. I didn't want that for our town, and I think we have been extremely disciplined. We are accounting for every penny and ensuring that it is spent only in the categories that we laid out. I am really proud of that, that our town has done that, and that our Citizens Oversight Committee has worked so hard to verify that. I would like to see that requirement that we have a Citizens Oversight Committee take a look at the expenditures annually and report back to the community. By the way, those reports are online. Rebecca, can you tell me exactly where somebody might find that on the town website?
There's a drop-down under government, and it's
Okay, Mike, a drop-down under government.
a drop-down under government on the town of Corte Madera's website, townofcortemadera.org, and you can go to boards, commissions, and committees, and under boards, commissions, and committees, you would go to Sales Tax Citizens Oversight Committee.
Thank you. I also want to point out that a few other things have changed over the last several years. Number one, transportation funding is really down quite a bit, especially at the local level. I mean, the real local level to the towns. We are not getting as much money from the state. We're not getting as much money from the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. More and more indications from not just Sacramento, but also from the MTC, is that transportation dollars are going to be tied more and more to housing production and priority development areas. This means we are going to be more and more on our own to fund things, especially things like local roads maintenance. It looks like Transportation Authority of Marin is unlikely to go out for an increase in their sales tax amount. I think they're going to probably keep it at a half cent, which means that source of funding is not going to increase for the town, and we will be increasingly reliant on our own funds to fund capital roads and multimodal projects. The other thing, of course, that's happened is that we are all much more aware of the effects of climate change, and that is going to be a huge issue that this town needs to face. If any of you have read the county vulnerability assessment, Bay Wave, you can see how much Corte Madera is vulnerable to flooding and other impacts of sea level rise. And by other impacts, I'm talking about infrastructure, access. Even if your property doesn't flood, the road to get to your property might be flooded, or it might impact things like, street lights and all kinds of other infrastructure. We need funding for that, if nothing else, for planning efforts. Hopefully, there will be some grant funding for that, but I'm not entirely optimistic because every other municipality is going to be going out for the same kinds of funds. So anyway, this is why I will be supporting this, and I support staff moving forward with this.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments?
Jim, you were... Oh, okay. I think it was in 2011, there was and I know you guys will remember this, there was an absolutely scathing grand jury report about the town of Corte Madera not having a reserve fund and the incredible amount of debt that we were carrying. And it was on the front page of the IJ, and we were in bad shape. I mean, if you looked at our financial statements, I remember getting the weekly financial statements, we didn't have any cash. We were passing, remember the trans, which we were passing every year, which was a financial instrument that basically we were using every year to float cash to the town so we could pay our bills. It was really tough, and that was only 6 or 7 years ago. The tax has clearly worked and has put us in a much stronger financial position than we were in. So that's great news, right? No question about it. Do we need it going forward? I think we do. Diane, again, great points. You're absolutely right. Everything I'm reading and hearing about transportation funding it's going to go away. It's going to be tied to housing production. Housing production is going to be tied to transportation corridors, and if you're not building housing, your state transportation funds aren't coming. And it's going to become more on us to figure out how to do that. And sea level rise is obviously incredibly critical for this town as well. 1/3 of Corte Madera is actually in a floodplain. It's in the flood zone. And Dr. Bundy, thank you for making an absolutely outstanding point, which I tell people all the time. People who move here think there's no flood problem because we don't have a flood problem, but they don't realize we have $20 million in the ground and a very vigilant staff that prevents the flood problem, right? So they think, well, what are we worried about, right? But what people don't realize, and I remember the first time I saw this in a staff meeting, we're like Holland. here, right? I mean, people don't realize that. We've got levees and pump stations and canals, and it's expensive to maintain, and it's going to get a lot harder in the future. And I think you also made a great point, Dr. Bundy, which I totally agree with. I think that lack of seeing flooding is going to make getting another parcel tax passed for flood control extremely difficult. You know, Larkspur was able to get I think their sales tax passed easily because every time, you know, every year when they come out with a report of where the worst roads are in the Bay Area, it's always Larkspur, right? It's always like in the top 5. So everyone knows the roads are terrible. Let's approve the sales tax. We'll get the roads fixed. Here, we're going to need it more for sea level rise, but people don't see it. The other thing I think that's going to make parcel taxes harder to get approved in the future is the tax laws just changed, right? And the state of California, well, federal tax, you're only going to be able to deduct up to $10,000 in property taxes or state income taxes. So those parcel taxes, we've always said, oh, that's just going to be a tax deduction. Well, for a lot of people in the future, those parcel taxes aren't going to be a tax deduction. So I think that's going to make that harder as well. So for all those reasons, I do think we're going to need this sales tax in the future to continue to improve really, really critical infrastructure needs. I think we need to do a better job of explaining why. You know, tonight's presentation was good, but if you just look at it kind of on a macro level and you just look at numbers, kind of the initial, unless you're really paying close attention, the initial reaction is kind of like, we got a lot of money, as opposed to, we have a lot of needs. And I think we need to present that case better to the public, I think, than we did tonight. And I look forward to that process continuing in the future. And I think, you know, we need to do that. I would love to get the Sales Tax Oversight Committee in here to hear what they have to say about it and what their point of view is on how this money has been spent. But I do support this thing moving forward, trying to get this on the ballot in June. But I think we need to continue to have and engage the public here in dialogue about why it's necessary and why we think it is. Because we all clearly think it's important, but I'm not sure that the public does yet.
Thanks, Bob. Jim?
Well, I guess in terms of the timeline, if it's going to go on the June ballot, we will have had to make all the ordinances and determinations by roughly the end of the first week in March. If this is going to be done through an ordinance, we have to have 2 votes, correct?
Yes, we'd have 2 readings, but we don't have the 30-day wait because it's going to the voters anyway.
Okay.
So you can, we would just need 2 regular council meetings to bring it forward for a first reading and a second reading, and then at the second reading, you can also call your election. So I think you have 3 regular council meetings, and we need 2. So we have an extra one in there. I like to suggest that you not go all the way up to the wire, at least in your planning stage, in case you need that extra week, and then you would move forward. You could call all of your elections at once. You have elections coming up for other types of elections, and that could all be done at once.
Okay, good. That's what I thought. So I guess basically, if we're going to make a determination to go forward with extending this tax, we need to then concentrate on explaining why exactly we need it and going to the voters probably no later than April with the town's explanation of why we want to extend the tax.
I can work with the clerk who would have the deadlines from your county registrar as to when they want to see everything, and we would bring that forward. And then there would also be the impartial analysis from your town attorney that would also explain the tax, and that would also go on. So there are specific deadlines that call out those dates. So perhaps if we are bringing this forward, we could also bring forward to you what the schedule would look like even beyond the legislative process, but also in terms of what we would need to submit and what the associated deadlines are for you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, everybody made comments? Now.
No,
Oh,
I'd move that we reopen
Yeah.
public comment.
yeah, but I just have a question. Todd, did you have more presentation? Okay. Okay, and back to, before we do our final discussion.
Still Patty Stoliar. I wanted to follow up with something Peter said and kind of tag on to what Bob Ravasio said. I contacted George a short while ago about, I wanted to know who is bearing this increase of the sales tax, if another sales tax. And I said, do you have any way of knowing what percentage of Corte Maderans are using, are generating the monies from this, and what about the rest of the Bay Area region? And George wrote back that there's no specific way that he could tell, but his estimate would be less than 10%, probably closer to 5% of Corte Madera generates the money for the sales tax. And if that's true, it really is important, as Bob was saying, to differentiate between property taxes that people feel personally and, you know, it gets them in their whatever, soul, versus this sales tax that is spread throughout generally the entire Bay Area because of how we do have the two regional shopping centers. So I just wanted to quantify what Peter said and follow up what Bob said. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Jean?
Yes, Jean Greenbaum. So I'm sort of just doing, this is just discussion, right? I mean, I have nothing formal. But I believe the $20 million that was spent, was that before the taxes, the override taxes? I mean, the $20 million that was invested, so there were sources for that work, right? So, and then I was confused about, there's a flood control tax and there's a storm drain tax. So I think one of the things that taxpayers really get ticked off about, at least this taxpayer does, is that you don't look at the whole tax structure. You kind of just keep adding this and you keep adding that. And yes, they're all great sources of revenue, but I think they have to all, if they're all doing the same thing, they have to be coordinated, or maybe get rid of some of these. If we're spending a lot of money from the oversight, the override tax, which I kind of like because it is a regional tax and I'm not paying it directly. I mean, it depends on how much you're spending. So, but then I should be paying less taxes for Corte Madera. I shouldn't be paying for a flood control tax. I shouldn't be paying for a storm drain tax. The citizens of Corte Madera should be benefiting from this, other than having more money to spend on this. I think if they thought that some of the taxes, especially now with the new tax law, it's really going to hit a lot of people. And taxes increase every year. I don't know why they increase every year. We just saved $800,000 because we, consolidate. We did all these great things, and yet taxes keep going up. That shouldn't happen if we're going to continue this tax. I think you got to get rid of some of the ones that are on our tax bill. And believe me, this would pass with a 99% voter thing. So I don't know if I'm confused about this flood control tax and the storm drain tax, whether those are two different taxes. I don't know enough about it, but I think having all these different taxes is really frustrating. So, because they're all going to the same place.
Right, thank you. Karen?
Hi, Karen Gerbosi, 111 Parkview Circle, chairperson of the Sales Tax Citizens Override Committee. A couple things is, it seems that, particularly given Jean's comments, is to be very clear in our communications about the distinction between sales tax and property tax and how it's going to show up. So I'm looking at this and listening to it as how to communicate it to citizens. And so it's important for citizens to understand that this is not going to show up on their property tax bill. And by and large, if George's estimates are correct, about 90% of it is showing up on somebody else's cash receipt. So that's important, and I know that that's not a a factual thing, but there should be some way that we can make that estimate and communicate it. The other thing is that I think it's important to make sure that we communicate value to citizens of all parts of Corte Madera. So I know that when we look at, when we looked at that map of, what's happening over on the east side and those things, people up there don't care of whether or not we can get in and out from Tiburon to the freeway. So you have to make sure that people from all parts of Corte Madera see value in it for them, and that it's not going to show up to be, quote, the people on the flats or the people over on the east side or whatever. I mean, I live in Meadow Creek Station, and we deal with this with 148 homeowners. We have people that live along Coke Road, and they whine about how much we pay for the landscaping for the people that live down there. So whenever we do anything, we have to make sure that all of our homeowners understand that there's value in it for all of them, and that the money isn't going to just some people. So I'm just saying that from the point of view of how to communicate it to citizens, so they'll say, yes, I want this because there's something in it for me. Thanks.
Thank you. Eli?
Madam Mayor, members of the council, I'm Eli Beckman. I live on Staghound Passage. I just wanted to speak in favor also of this extending the Measure B sales tax. I think it's a pretty relatively small tax, especially as we heard it has a pretty minute effect on Corte Maderans, but it has a really major impact on many critical aspects of our town that we've heard from here tonight. I think in light of the sort of recent history of the town, what we've gone through after the financial crisis and all that, and in light of what we've heard tonight, it really makes sense to extend this tax. I think that it's time to invest in Corte Madera's sort of well-being now that we're on much more stable footing than we have been in our recent history. And we're, I think, fortunate to be in a position now where we can invest in both preventing the worst effects of climate change down the road that's has the potential to cause massive property damage, and also to invest in our town as a form of economic insurance against, who knows when the next downturn is going to be, but we don't want to be hit again like we were. So I think it's important that we do maintain this sales tax. It's been very well managed and well spent, as we've seen in the presentation here tonight. And I totally agree with Karen and Councilman Ravazio's comments that communication will be really important in terms of explaining to the town why this needs to be continued. But I am very confident that voters will be receptive to it because I think it's clearly has a lot of merit. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bob Bundy. Wanted to clarify the storm tax and the flood tax, which are one and the same, and generate about $660,000 a year, as Todd showed on the slide. It's due to be up in 2023, and it's really designed for flood protection, but the way it's structured, probably a third of it is used for replacement, corrugated metal pipes up in the hills. So the hills also get some benefit from that in the storm drains and the infrastructure on the hills. In the past, it has also been used for emergency repairs. And so the period where we had the really severe downturn, we had very little new infrastructure developed because that flood tax ended up being used for major repairs, the San Clemente pump station, and also the one at Madera del Presidio. So I think we really need to look at this sales tax as something that may replace that, because we may not be able to see this extended for some of the reasons that Councilmember Ravazio mentioned, and just the fact that we haven't really seen flooding, and so it may be hard to pass a flood tax even if we're looking at sea level rise. Thank you.
Thank you. Carl?
Still Carl? I just love that comment. I wanted to just amend my comments about this passed barely. Thank you, Todd. Did a quick look here, and certainly it's 50% plus one. But that raised an interesting question. I'd love to hear this addressed at the next time. That is only because it's a tax that's going into the general fund. Pretty much sounds like this is not going into the general fund here. As Bob just said, this could be allocated into other taxes if they're gone. So if it's a special use or special fund, it's a 2/3. So I guess I'd like the town to really explain well to taxpayers here in the town that, the difference between those two definitions. And again, I really want a presentation from these folks, and I think their role should be expanded to include other taxes that this town is voting on and following to the extent. And I know you've got tons of time to do that, or maybe we should rotate people on and off. But it's pretty clear that these folks have done a lot of work, and they care a lot about what's going on in this town. And I'm pretty disappointed that they were not alerted to this meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anybody else? Okay, we'll close it to public comment, and for sure, next time we have this as part of our discussion, to make sure that everybody on the tax override committee is noticed.
Can I clarify that? We did send the staff report to the entire oversight committee by email to notify them. So that was made. And again, in my mind was to alert them, which we did. And then the second part was to give this presentation and then immediately go back to the oversight committee to really have a broader discussion of communication and the feedback we get from today. And then following that meeting would be to go to the flood board and have a conversation with them and to come back to council, because I think one of the key discussion points that we've kind of talked about, and thank you, Dr. Bundy, for clarifying it, is that the sales tax measure does seem like the best tax measure moving forward to handle our capital improvements, and we may want to consider the property tax. Again, the storm drain and flood tax is one of the same. It's $98. It's a parcel tax. So we may want to consider reevaluating that in future years. And so.
Yeah. So, thank you. Yeah, I think that the points that everybody brought up were good. Especially, I want to thank Jean and Karen for coming. I guess your fellow comrades maybe didn't get the email, or
They're stuck in traffic.
they might be. Right, so Tuesday nights always a good night for TV. So anyway, especially thank you for coming, and for the job that you've been doing right from the get-go has been really, really helpful. I think that one thing, too, that I'm looking forward to, a lot of times people can't see the infrastructure or see what's under the ground, but at our opening of the mini intergenerational center, hopefully in April, people are going to be able to actually see the result of but a modest spending from that particular fund. And it's something that will impact all sides of town and of all ages. So, and I think it would have been difficult to accomplish it without the tax override money. So, did you have a comment?
I did. Thank you, Madam Mayor. If you may, the town manager has asked me to clarify the question that was raised by a member of the public with respect to what is a general tax and how is that different than a special tax. And so with the mayor's indulgence, I can provide a brief comment. A general tax can be used for any general fund purpose, which really means any purpose that is a valid purpose that the town might have. It can be used for operational issues. It can be used for capital improvements. It can be used for any purpose. A general tax, a general sales tax, you can only pass at a general election, which is why we are looking at either coming forward this June or coming forward at the next general election. That would be an election where you actually have a council members being up for election. And the reason for that is we want to make sure that enough folks are coming to the polls so that there really is a meaningful number of citizens who have the opportunity to vote. If, however, you decide to pass or to bring forward to the electorate a sales tax measure on an off cycle, so at a special election, you can do so. But generally speaking, it would be a special tax. And a special tax is limited only for certain designated purposes that the voters approve. So if you were going to go forward with a special tax, you would be much more limited much more narrowly than you do with a general tax measure. Additionally, a special tax, because you're on an off-cycle election and you may have fewer voters coming to the polls, requires a supermajority, and so that would be a 2/3 vote. So in this case, what staff is recommending is that you come forward, as you did last time, with a general tax measure at a general election. And so if the voters approve it by 50% plus one voter, it gets passed. And it can be used for any town purpose. So I think I have answered the question and perhaps alleviated whatever confusion there may have been.
I have a question.
Yes.
When you say that. When we passed this before, there were parameters set for what the money was going to go to. And so we had 6 or 7 categories of where that money was going to be allocated. Now, it wasn't just going into the general fund.
Mhm.
It was for special, or for certain.
And that's what I understand the staff has done, and that's what it's been used for, which is different than, is there a legal restriction on what those funds can be used for?
But are you saying then that if we continue it with the parameters that we have right now, then that becomes a 2/3 vote?
No. If it's a general tax measure, it can be used for any purpose, but certainly it would be up to the council in its budget every year to make sure that the commitment that the council made in terms of what it intends to use these funds for will be followed through.
Okay, great.
So ultimately, council retains control to make sure that what it wants the funds to be used for, it actually will be used for.
Okay, Diane?
Thank you. My understanding is that the funds do go into the general fund. It is just, we have asked for a special accounting
Right.
to show exactly where those funds have been spent, but that it is not in its own separate fund. So if we decide that we want to spend that money on, new chairs or something, we can do that. Or if we want to spend that money on, paying the electric bill, we can do that. We can spend that money really on anything that would normally be spent out of the general fund. It's just, we have chosen to ourselves be very disciplined and only spend it on things that we said originally we wanted to spend it on,
Right.
which includes reserves. So let's say in the future, we're anticipating something very difficult that the town might face, maybe a new law about how streets need to be striped in anticipation of autonomous vehicles or something like that. We can maybe make the decision one year to increase the amount of reserves or increase the amount we spend here. We're not locked in to a spending plan the way we would be under a special tax. So it does give us a lot more flexibility. Now, the Citizens Oversight Committee will still report on how we spent the money. So it is, in everybody's interest to ensure that we spend it in a very responsible way that was in keeping with the overall intention of the voters.
Okay, well, and just so that everybody's aware, yes, it's in the general fund, but it is separate. It's accounted for separately. It's not commingled with what's already there.
Well, technically, it's commingled, but it's tracked separately. Actually,
Well,
maybe Daria can specify.
Consolidated into one general fund.
The town has set up a separate fund on its own books for the purpose of segregating the expenditures and revenues for the sales tax and is not part of the operating budget. But when the financial statements are presented, then the sales tax fund rolls up into the general fund, as do, certain other funds as well. But the town has it segregated for its own tracking purposes.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
I had,
Comments?
Well, I guess the way I'd summarize it is, it's a special tax, it's legally constrained, and if it's a general tax, it's controlled by town policy. And we just need to make certain that we follow the policy, and prior to taking it to the voters, we need to agree on what the policy will be going forward.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
That explains it well. Bob?
Nothing.
Okay.
I just had a couple of other things just about, like flood control and some of the other more general comments. The $20 million that was invested in flood control in the town began in the mid to late 80s. So that was investment over, a few decades. In, I think it was 83, the town flooded severely, much of Marin. 82?
82.
82, thank you. The town was severely flooded. There is a YouTube, if you look up 1982 Marin flood or something like that, there's a YouTube that has some helicopter footage of Marin. It shows the freeway in central Corte Madera, and then it kind of goes up to San Rafael, and you can see some of the Quonset huts. I'm not sure which side of town that was from in San Rafael, but the whole neighborhood is flooded. Evidently, our previous Public Works Director once told me that Corte Madera used to be the go-to place for the news cameras during flooding. Now it's the Manzanita Park and Ride. Every time that floods, the news cameras are up there. They used to come to Corte Madera. So Corte Madera does have the capability for some very serious flooding, but with a lot of serious investment out of our general fund that we all paid for over many years. We have been able to eliminate that. But that takes a lot of money to maintain, and a lot of that infrastructure needs to be replaced. I would support taking another look at the storm drain tax and maybe seeing if that can be sunsetted at a particular time. That might answer the something for me that might have some local residents concerned. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay.
One more thing then.
Yeah.
I would agree with you. I think that makes
Thank
a
you.
lot of sense.
Phase it out.
Yeah, take a serious look at that. And also just on that, on the flood control, I believe there still are components of the flood control plan that have still not been built. Because,
Quite a lot.
yeah, because of what we were talking about before. When the town got in really serious financial straits, the flood control money was just being used to repair what was there, and we never built what we originally intended to build. And Karen, to your point, flood control, I think a lot of people think it's a Golden Hind Passage issue or it's a Mariner Cove issue. It's a whole town issue. I mean, because, Carl, you live on one of our flood control basins, right? I mean, you're in a flood zone. It's on the west side, it's not just on the bay side. And also, one of the most important things the flood control program controls and protects is our shopping centers, which, as we've been talking about, are the financial engine that drives the sales tax revenue that helps this town function. So it's a really critical thing that we need to keep an eye on, as well as the rest of the infrastructure. So,
Yeah.
and I think that's the kind of thing we need to make sure everybody understands, that it's benefiting all of us. So thank you for that.
Okay, thank you. So I think as far as direction goes on this, that I've just perceived that the consensus is that we do want to look to renew the measure, that if we can focus on really making an effort, an outreach effort to inform the public so everybody knows, and also that everybody's clear on the impact that this measure to date has had, then also to probably include how something like the storm drainage tax can be addressed, or something that shows that, yes, we're keeping this in place, but maybe we can lower something else. I think that it's really a great point that Patty brought up, that the sales tax really has very little impact on our pocketbooks, that it's the benefit we're gleaning from it is coming from people outside of town. So anyway, and I guess we have to move pretty quickly on this to get this all ready for the June ballot. Yes.
One other comment. We had talked about having a town kind of workshop on flood control. The history of kind of what we're doing, sort of what the future might look like, especially addressing sea level rise. My understanding is that was scheduled for February or March. I don't know if we're still on that time frame. It really is kind of just to educate the voters. I think it's important to kind of outline sort of where our big ticket expenditures might be in the future, but I don't want it to necessarily look like this was planned in conjunction with the sales tax measure, because that wasn't the case. So I think we're going to need to be sensitive about the messaging and not attach a bunch of, we need you to pass the sales tax, for this, what we're presenting at this workshop, and just make sure that the workshop is just about education, and just be sensitive about that.
Oh, I appreciate that, Vice Mayor. And then our intent is, again, I mean, it's, I hear you loud and clear on the presentation, telling the story, being able to follow the money, being able to follow our challenges moving forward. I want to share with you, our intent is not to get a consultant and spend $30,000 of taxpayer dollars to do a survey and have a professional community expert or consultant come in and sell this thing. This is a completely factual, data-driven kind of conversation. We're going to start that again with the Oversight Committee and really start with them and build that story and then move forward. We are going to include the flood board at the next meeting because it's important, because that's where the flood tax comes into play. We want their input, and then we'll begin that information discussion. So thank you for your feedback. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, and thank you to staff, too, for supporting this so well, really giving a clear picture to everybody. Okay, then we will move on. Now it's town manager and council member reports. Todd?
Well, this is the big update. Again, we've been doing our weekly newsletters, updates. I hope everyone goes and registers for that newsletter update. I think I'm just really excited about staff. I'm excited about having Daria and Peter on board for both Public Works and Finance. Daria to really tell the story of our financial situation and to be able to explain it in a really easy manner. And tonight's an example of how important that is. And Peter, you can see his expertise and how good he is, and one of his strengths is overseeing capital improvements projects. And so when you look at the importance of not only being able to have the money to begin a project, but you have to execute it. And I'm really excited having Peter on board and getting those projects going in the coming months. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions? Okay, then on to council member reports. Diane, would you like to start?
Sure. I attended a Central Marin Sanitation Agency meeting. CMSA is working on its 5-year capital plan. There are some big-ticket projects that CMSA is going to be undertaking. It's going to affect the amounts our sanitary district number 2, is going to need to pay CMSA for wastewater treatment. CMSA is endeavoring to keep the increases below 4% per year. But we will be definitely seeing some increases from CMSA. I know our staff is on top of that. We have some reserves in sanitary district number 2, but we have some capital investments to make also. So, but again, this is just for the wastewater treatment portion of our sewer expenses, not our capital investments in our collection system. So the overall impact to our ratepayers, should we decide to increase fees down the road, I think will be very modest. So That is one thing. A second thing is that the NPDES permit, there are way too many acronyms in government, so let me actually, oh, do I even have that one? You know what? I don't even know what NPDES stands for, but it is the permit that CMSA has with the state to operate the wastewater treatment facility. In the past, CMSA has always worked with the state to renew their permit every several years. This year, the state wanted CMSA to either expand its facility at the tune of tens, if not $100 million, to allow for increased capacity during wet weather events, or somehow reduce I&I, inflow and infiltration. Thank you, at least that's one acronym I know. The funny thing about, or what's unique about our system, though, is that we are the collection agency, Sanitary District Number 2. We partnered many years ago with Ross Valley Sanitary, San Rafael Sanitary, to create CMSA, which treats the water, but CMSA does not collect. So in order to reduce I&I, infiltration and inflow, really that's on the collection side of things. So how it worked out is that the state has added each of the member agencies to the NPDES permit that allows CMSA to operate the wastewater agency. So we are a co-permittee on the NPDES permit. We have committed to 5 projects over the next 7 years to reduce I&I into our wastewater collection system. Those are projects we need to do anyway. I&I really happens when there are little cracks in the systems or separations, water that percolates down from the rain runoff gets into the wastewater system, and it means the flows into CMSA during rain events are just hugely increased. It can overwhelm CMSA's wastewater treatment system. Another problem, of course, is that we are so close to the bay that our low-line pipes, laterals, storm or sewer mains can also pick up seawater that infiltrates up from the bay mud. So these are things we're going to need to invest in a few of these projects in order to comply with this NPDES permit. If you'd like to learn more, maybe we can have that on a future agenda, or you can talk with Todd and/or Peter, our Public Works Director, offline. So.
Okay, thank you.
Are we in any way jointly and severally liable for what other participants in this arrangement are doing or not doing?
Well, that's a good question that we're still trying to get through. CMSA is the one that really has the permitted process. It is the wastewater treatment that is permitted. So really, it all kind of comes back to CMSA. The responsibility of the individual collection agencies is limited to complying with what they have promised they will do to reduce I&I. So I do not believe at this point that there is any liability to SD2 if, for instance, Ross Valley or San Rafael fails to meet their obligation. That would, however, cause a problem with CMSA.
Yeah, I asked that question. Yeah. And there wasn't a definite answer because what I was concerned was that there could be an emergency declaration, for example, and I'm just using San Rafael, and that they didn't have the capacity or the funds, and so there could be a borrowing, and so they really don't even, as far as I know, unless they've come up with anything since then, it was left very much in the air. And I think that's something that is important to keep tabs on.
And I know that Todd and Peter are keeping tabs on that, if I'm not mistaken.
We are, and I just wanted to add that the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit is what we're referring to, and that's referenced in the Clean Water Act. And so this is a permit that has already existed. It's being renewed. So from a practical operation standpoint, things will carry on status quo for us. But as the Vice Mayor pointed out, we will have some expenditures that will contribute to the Central Marin Sanitation Agency's work, and that's just something that we're budgeted and on top of. So,
And might I say that work, investing in that work to reduce I&I will actually benefit us by reducing the amount of wastewater we are sending to CMSA. So the tally that they keep of where the water is coming from, it'll actually reduce it for SD2, which will ultimately result in reduced fees.
Okay, reports. Jim?
Nothing to report.
Bob?
Yeah, a couple things. Ross Valley Paramedic, we had our meeting and we approved our annual audit. And financially, that organization is in terrific shape, looking very good. Disaster preparedness, we had our monthly meeting, and John and Lee Howard, we're going to have to build a shrine to them or something. They are just on, pardon the pun, wow, they're on fire. But they're just getting so many NRGs going throughout Larkspur and Corte Madera right now. The interest is off the charts. There's going to be some neighborhood drills happening in March, so that's going really, really well. We also had a homelessness committee meeting, which we have not met in a while. We looked at the new mobile showers, which we are part of the funding for. They're really terrific. That program is going to start up very soon. And we came out of the meeting that I have two things we're going to have to bring to the council eventually. One of them is that the current locations for the showers, and the important thing I just want to point out again with these showers, part of what's going on is the county is changing the whole way they're approaching homelessness, and the short version of it is they're focusing on the people who are, they think, most in need, who are accounting for the highest percentage of police incidents and emergency room visits, and they're trying to identify those people and trying to get them into housing as quickly as possible. And they have figured out that that's the model that's being used throughout the country and seems to be having some effect, and they're applying that model here. The showers are important because the showers are done by appointment, and they're manned by people, personnel from the homelessness staff that operates at the county level. So it gives them an opportunity to engage with them, meet them, and then try to get them into services. So that's the other part of the showers, besides providing health benefits and dignity and all those sorts of things. Anyway, one of the things they're asking is whether or not some of the other towns can sponsor locations as well. Because the closer they are to the homeless populations, the better service the better they're going to be used. I've already talked to Todd about it, so we may be coming back to the council with some possibilities and recommendation. And basically, it needs a garden hose and a 220-volt outlet. So that's one. The second thing is that, as I said, they are being sponsored by the Community Homelessness Fund, which all the towns in Marin County came together for the first time ever, and sponsored and all contributed based on population size. That expires in 2018. We're going to need to consider extending that. And I think the goal would be probably to continue to fund the showers for a few more years. So that might be on a future agenda as well. I'll talk to Todd about that. But we may be able to get some of these folks out and do a short presentation and show you what they're doing.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
This next month, February, our council will be hosting MCCMC, and the topic is going to relate to senior programs. The presenter is going to be somebody from either one of our supervisors or one of their staff. The Board of Supervisors has announced that they are going to make 2018 the year of the elder adult. And so there'll be a lot of focus on that. We've been busy trying to get the intergenerational center started up, and it's been really, really great. We've had some terrific volunteers who will conduct programs, and we have some really interesting things. There'll be somebody teaching how to use a 3D printer. There's going to be book club, watercolor, I can't even think, there, chair yoga. There's just a vast array of events just to start off. And then we anticipate that we will develop more as time goes on. Tomorrow is the third Wednesday speaker series event that is sponsored by Corte Madera Park and Rec, Age-Friendly Corte Madera, and the Marin Villages, Twin Cities Villages, excuse me. And the program is going to be on how you can update your home if you need things like grab bars, things like this that where there are services available that can do it for homeowner, but also if people are considering constructing a junior unit, a second unit, how they go about it. And we have two distinguished presenters. One is our own Brian Fenty, who is with our building department, and he's going to present, and then his counterpart from the city of Larkspur. And that's going to be at 1 o'clock tomorrow at the Central Marin Police Authority Community Room, 1 o'clock. And so everybody's invited to attend. It's not necessarily exclusively an age type of thing. It's for anyone. And I'll report back Friday. I go to the first, for this year, the first policy committee, Housing and Community Development Policy Committee for the League of California Cities, and that'll be in Sacramento this coming Friday. So next meeting, I'll bring back information from that, because not only are we discussing housing issues, but we also, everybody comes at the very beginning to get an update on the governor's budget report and things that are going on up there in the legislature. So then, going on, if no one has anything else, our draft agenda. Does anybody have any questions or anything that they would like seen added to that?
Madam Mayor, members of the council, if I may. So there's a couple things that we are going to add. As you can see, it's a pretty limited, I like this agenda as it stands, but we're going to add a facilities discussion. Again, it's kind of like today's discussion, just a proactive view of our facilities and the needs of staff, where we're going to place staff now and in the future. We will add a running informational sales tax measure update on all future council meetings, just so we can continue to have this conversation publicly. And also, we are due, in October, we were due an evaluation of the town manager. And our agenda items have been pretty busy up until this point, so I pushed it back a little bit, but I think it's time for you to give me some feedback. And so I was going to add that closed session at this upcoming meeting as well for my evaluation. And anything else that you'd like to add.
Great. Okay, thank you. And now, did you?
All I'd suggest is with the sales tax, coordinate with the town attorney to make certain the way we do it
Always informational. Yeah, we don't.
will work so that if we do want to go for our June vote, we've got all our ducks lined up.
Okay, and then I would like to entertain a motion to adjourn to closed session, and then we will be reopening it after the two items of discussion.
So moved?
Second. Do we really have to vote on adjourning to closed session?
No.
Okay, so then, thank you all for coming.
Carl?
Oh, does anybody have any public comment on closed session? Okay, if not, we're temporarily adjourned.
It looks like it'll be like $500,000 a year.